If I can introduce myself, my name is John Hill. I am chairman of the Ulster Beekeepers Association, and we normally run a conference about this time of the year, but unfortunately due to COVID that has not been possible this year or last year. But we'd hope that we'll maybe be able to get back to a conference possibly in 2023. So it really is a great welcome really from the Ulster Beekeepers Association. And indeed this evening I'm delighted that we have Professor Dave Goulson from Sussex University, who will be speaking about his new book, which is called Silent Earth. Our sponsors this evening, and we are very, very grateful to all our sponsors, but our sponsors this evening are Thorn Beehives Limited from Rand in England, and they've been a great supporter of the efforts that we do set, and especially with these webinars. So we're very, very grateful to Thorns for their sponsorship of this lecture. As I say, we're reserving the chat line on your Zoom controls to tell us where you're from, and then the Q&A is only for questions which we would like to for our speaker, and we'll be having a question and answer session after the webinar is over for about 15 to 20 minutes. And certainly, yes, we'd like you to see as many questions as possible. And certainly, if it's a question, is that your question, we run out of time for questions, well then, Professor Goulson will be kind, I'm sure, to be able to answer any that you pressing questions that you may have. So if I could really just say, go now to introduce our speaker. It's Professor Dave Goulson from the University of Sussex, and I'll be speaking to really about the very really dramatic drop in the insect population worldwide. And to him, really, insects have been really fascinating for all his life, and they really finds them sort of most fascinating, weird, and wonderful, because they're food and pollinators and recyclers and all sorts of things for all parts of the food chain and the animal kingdom. So Dave Goulson is the Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex, specializing in bee ecology. He has published more than 300 scientific articles on the ecology and conservation of bumblebees and other insects. He has, in fact, been named, say, with the Sunday Times, producing a bestseller called A Sting in the Tail, which is a popular science book about bumblebees, and was published in 2013. And this was followed by several other books. There was A Buzz in the Meadow, Bee Quest, The Garden Jungle, Gardening for Bumblebees, and this year, last year, Silent Earth. Professor Goulson founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006, which is a charity which has grown to over 12,000 members. And he has had various awards. For example, he was awarded the Zoological Society of London's Claravate Award for communicating zoology in 2015. And he was named as number 8 in the BBC Wildlife magazine's list of the top 50 most influential people in conservation. So really, ladies and gentlemen, I would like then to welcome our speaker and to hand over and to start the webinar on his book, Silent Earth. Dave.
Thank you, John. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Just please bear with me while I share my screen. Shouldn't take a moment. Go full screen. Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you this evening about insects, as you've gathered, about really the subject of my new book, which is insects, how amazing, weird, wonderful, important they are, the evidence that many of them are in rapid decline, a little bit about what's causing that, and then I'll talk for a reasonable amount of time on what we can do about it, which is obviously the the key thing. There's no point in depressing the hell out of you without giving you some suggestions as to what to do about it. So insects, it's a huge subject, as you'll see as we go on. They are so numerous. There are millions, literally millions of species. So where do I start talking about insects? I thought I'd start right at the beginning with a kind of very quick potted history of insects, if you'll bear with me. So insects were amongst the very first animals to colonize the land. They go back an incredible length of time. It just recently found that the first insects that we know of appeared about 480 million years ago, which is a really long time, obviously. And so they were amongst the first creatures on land, and they remain to this day the most successful group of organisms on land, certainly in terms of numbers of individuals and numbers of species. They way outnumber anything else on the planet, including, of course, us. They were the first creatures to develop flight about 380 million years ago, so long before there were dinosaurs. And they had the skies to themselves for probably something like 170 million years before pterodactyls came along. Just in case you're interested, it's thought that flights evolved 4 times. First the insects, then the pterodactyls and co. Then birds, and then finally bats. Anyway, insects were there long before anybody else. And oxygen concentrations when insects first evolved were much higher than they are today, which enabled insects to get much bigger. And there were dragonfly-like insects zooming around in the Carboniferous, which had a wingspan of about 60 centimeters, about 2 feet, which must have been quite a sight. Love to see one of those. Anyway, so insects have proliferated. I think I may have already mentioned, but there are in the region of 1.1 million species so far named, and estimated to be maybe another 3-4 million that we haven't even named yet. Isn't that mind-boggling? So they come in an incredible diversity of shapes, colors, sizes, adapted to all sorts of different life cycles and behavioral strategies. They live almost everywhere you can think of on land or in fresh water. So I thought I'd just warm you up before we get on to anything too serious by showing you some nice pictures. Well, there's some of them already, and just highlighting a few of the amazing insects that we share our planet with. So there we go. Isn't that sweet? That is a type of beetle. It's actually a type of weevil, which is a family of beetles. It looks rather like some kind of cartoon character or a Muppet or something, but it's a real creature. Weevils are actually the most speciose family of all organisms on the planet. There are enormous numbers of weevils and enormous numbers of beetles. Many insects have evolved, they're the favorite food of many larger creatures, which I'll come back to later. So many insects have evolved mechanisms to avoid being eaten, such as amazing camouflage. There's a bush cricket, or as if you're American, a katydid, disguising itself as a leaf. Many moths are beautifully camouflaged so that birds struggle to find them in the daytime. I took this photograph it's the forest floor of Ecuador, in the cloud forest, and I think there are 7 or 8 moths there. Some are more obvious than others, but some beautiful examples of camouflage in the leaf litter. Then there are other insects that don't appear to be well camouflaged at all, but this is an orchid mantis, which has evolved to look like a flower, which of course serves the same purpose. It means that insect-eating birds won't eat it because they don't recognize it as an insect. And it serves the dual purpose that bees and other pollinating insects may attempt to visit the flower and of course then meet a grisly end. There are insects that pretend to be other insects. In particular, there are lots of insects that pretend to be bees or wasps. And of course, I'm sure you know why, because bees and wasps have a sting. And so lots of predators might avoid trying to eat them. So this is a completely harmless, it's a British hoverfly species that's pretending to be a bumblebee. And it's a pretty impressive mimic, and to a trained human eye, it's fairly easy to tell them apart. But for most amateur humans, and presumably most birds, it does a very passable impression of a bumblebee. Then there are insects that avoid being eaten in a different way. They sequester poisons in their body, and then they advertise that they're not edible with really bright colours. A couple of exotic examples, and the more familiar cinnabar moth on the right there. And there are just some insects that are just plain weird, and we don't know why. This is a type of frog hopper, which grows these waxy, looks like sort of, it's got optic fibers coming out of its bottom or something. Nobody has the faintest idea why it does that, what purpose that serves. You'd think it would be quite a handicap. Maybe it's like the tail of a peacock, who knows? Insects, I mean, they're mostly very small, and we tend not to, most people never pay them any attention. But if you look at them under a microscope, some of them are just stunningly beautiful. So this is a type of jewel wasp that you find, there's several species in the United Kingdom. Absolutely gorgeous creatures, actually parasites of some of our solitary bees, but hard to resent them when they look so beautiful. There's even, look at this one, this is a bug, a true bug, a shield bug from Asia, which does bear quite a resemblance to Elvis. I'm sure it's completely coincidental, but it still makes me smile. So my speciality are bees, and I guess many of you tuning in are interested in bees. Bees have an interesting history. They're relatively newcomers amongst insects. The earliest bee fossil we have is a bee in amber from about 120 million years ago, which doesn't sound like much compared to 480 million years ago when insects started, but it's still actually a long time before Tyrannosaurus rex evolved, for example. 120 million years ago, the first bee appeared, and it evolved from a wasp. Bees are essentially wasps turned vegetarian, if you like. The ancestor would have been a wasp that would have probably had an underground burrow that it stocked with paralyzed prey, which would have probably been insects, maybe caterpillars or possibly spiders, and laid its eggs on them. But the ancestor of the bees started using pollen instead of paralyzed prey, and that must have worked. Pollen is rich in protein, and the first bee was born, and bees themselves have since been very successful and speciated and proliferated and spread around the world. And at present, there are more than 20,000 known species of different types of bee. They come in an amazing array of interesting shapes and sizes. So I've been fascinated by insects all my life. I don't know why, don't know where it came from. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I remember collecting cinnabar caterpillars. I didn't know what they were at the time, but I put them in my lunchbox. So I found them in the primary school playing field and took them home and reared them up, and they turned into these beautiful red and black moths. And I thought that was just amazing. And I've been lucky enough to pursue a career and get paid to chase around after insects, which is a real privilege. This is not me, of course. This is my youngest son, Seth, who's currently in a bit of an insect phase. This is him with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin's no longer with us, but that's another story. But sadly, many people do grow out of that insect phase, which is something I try to fight. And I guess my mission in life is to try and persuade people to love insects, or at the very least to respect them for all the important stuff they do, which we'll come to in a second. And so although I've been really lucky to spend my life chasing around after these fascinating creatures, the whole way through my career, I've been slightly weighed down by the knowledge that insects are slowly disappearing. So almost all the studies that we have, the long-term data that we have on insects, suggest that they're in decline. I should stress that there are massive knowledge gaps, that for the majority of insect species on the planet, nobody is regularly counting them. We have no long-term data on their populations. And that includes every insect that lives in Africa and South America, for example, which is obviously where an awful lot of creatures live. But nonetheless, the data we do have are rather depressing. So, for example, these are data from UK butterflies, which are monitored in quite great depth and have been since 1976. And as you can see, so here they're split into the common ones at the top and the sort of rare habitat specialists at the bottom. Both groups are down. It was recently estimated that very roughly butterfly populations in the UK have halved since 1976. And coincidentally, so my son that I just showed you a picture of is 11. I was 11 in 1976, the start of this chart. So when I was his age, I lived in a world with twice as many butterflies as the world he's living in, which is a bit of a sad thought, and I'll come back to that. So, of course, it's not just butterflies that are declining. We have other data. Perhaps amongst the most dramatic are these data from Germany. So this study got a lot of media coverage when it was published in 2017. It's based on malaise traps. So that top right is a malaise trap. It looks a bit like a sort of tent, and it catches flying insects of all types, and most insects fly as adults. And what the chart is showing you, so these German entomologists have been putting these malaise traps on nature reserves all over Germany since the late 1980s. And the chart shows you the weight of insects caught per trap per day and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. So that's a 26-year period. And you can see it fell. On average, it fell by 76%. So it seems that 3/4 of the flying insects, at least the biomass of flying insects, disappeared from Germany in just 26 years, which is really alarming. Most of the long-term data we have are for Europe, where we tend to study our natural history quite intensively. There are some data sets from North America, and I'll just give you one more example from there. So this is the Monarch Butterfly, an absolutely beautiful, big, charismatic creature that's familiar to most people in North America. And it's famous for its extraordinary migration patterns and the fact that it hibernates en masse in forests in Mexico, where millions of butterflies gather in the winter, and they hang in trees, and it looks, you may have seen these on David Attenborough series over the years, him strolling through these forests where the trees are just covered in countless butterflies. So it looks like the leaves on the trees. Anyway, so the life cycle is really interesting and worth just dwelling on for a bit longer because it's extraordinary. So they spend their winters at the bottom of the map there in that reddish blob. And in the spring, as it warms up, they fly north, and the females lay eggs and they die, and their offspring grow to be adults and they head further north. And so it goes on through the spring and summer. And they might get through 3 generations and get right up into Canada before autumn sets in, and they turn around and set off back. But what's really extraordinary is that the butterflies flying back may be the grandchildren of the butterflies that left in the spring, but somehow they know exactly where to go, and they return to the site their grandparents left, and to within a few meters. They aggregate in just in total a few acres of forest, which is really extraordinary, and nobody knows how that works. Anyway, it does provide a really easy way of monitoring their population, because you can count them all because they're all in one place. I should just say as an aside that there is a small population that lives west of the Rockies and that overwinters in California, if you're wondering what's going on in that part of the map, but we won't worry about that. So the butterflies hibernating in Mexico are counted every year, and sadly they're in pretty steady decline. Their numbers are down by about 80% in about 25 years. Clearly, if that trend continues, there may not be any monarch butterflies migrating backwards and forwards in North America in a few years' time. Wouldn't that be a sad thing? So for most insects, we don't have these kind of data, but we often do have at least maps that we can construct of their distributions, and that also tells us a story. So for example, here we have the distribution of the shrill carder bumblebee, which is one of my favorite creatures, I must say. They're lovely animals. They're named because they have a high-pitched buzz for a bumblebee. You can, once you've got your ear in, you can often hear one before you see one. Anyway, as you can see, sadly they were never found in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, as far as I know. But they were pretty common in the southern half of Britain, in Wales and England, pre-1960. But as time's gone on, they've disappeared. So that by the millennium, they were down to about 6 discrete populations. And in fact, I went hunting for these bees in about the year 2000. And I managed to find some on Salisbury Plain. I remember, being very excited. It took weeks of searching around. They weren't very common even there, but we eventually caught one. But sadly, since then, that Salisbury Plain population has gone. It's extinct. So then we're down to 5. And I just highlighted the one on the Somerset Levels to the west of Salisbury Plain. That one seems to be disappearing. It's down to just 1 or 2 bees at the last census. So this bee is disappearing in front of us, on our watch, in our lifetime. It's entirely likely that this species could disappear from the UK in the next few years if we don't do something about it. Okay, that's probably enough of the evidence for insect declines. I want to digress slightly at this point, and you may wonder what on earth I'm talking about for a moment or two. But I'm going to talk about fish for a second. So there's a really interesting scientific study published by American scientists who studied the catches of game fishermen fishing off the coast of Florida over quite a long period, going back to the 50s. And the way they did that, so it's quite popular in the United States for people to go on holiday to Florida, and they pay quite a lot of money to go out in a boat for the day, and they catch the biggest fish they can, and traditionally they kill them and they bring them back and they hang them up, and they get their photograph taken standing next to their catch for the day. And what these scientists did was they studied the photographs. They measured the sizes of the fish, because the photographs were taken often in the same place by the same company year after year, and so they could roughly estimate the size of the fish from the photographs. And pretty obviously, you'll see straight away, the fish got smaller. 1957, there were sharks and some pretty big fish, whatever they are, I don't know, I'm not a fish expert. By 2007, the catches were quite pathetic in comparison. And that tells us there aren't many big fish left in the sea off Florida, which might seem somewhat irrelevant to my talk, but bear with me. So the reason I mention this is because of there's one sentence in the discussion of this paper, which says that although the fish have got smaller over time, the smiles on the faces of the fishermen haven't got any smaller. So top left, that's actually Ernest Hemingway with some big marlin or whatever that is that he's killed, smiling away, looking smug. bottom right is a more recent picture of a lady who's caught something considerably less impressive, but she seems just as happy. And of course, this is interesting because the reason she she's happy is she doesn't know what she's missing. She doesn't appreciate that had she been there 50 years earlier, she might have caught something much more impressive. She thinks what she's caught is big because from her experience, that is big. So we have this, it's called shifting baselines. We each have different ideas as to what is normal, and normal has changed over time. So there's two reasons I'm talking about this, really. The first is that the data we have for insect population decline only goes back so far. The very earliest data we have for insects is for butterflies from 1976. The German data only started in 1989. It's pretty certain that declines didn't start in 1976 or 1989. They probably started decades or perhaps even more than that earlier. And there are a few kind of tantalizing glimpses that suggest that, that this is the case. So at the top there is a quote from a guy called Frederick Frohawk, who was a butterfly enthusiast in the 1800s, lived in Kent in England. And he describes this scene that he saw one summer around that time. He's talking about the Silverwash Fritillary was in hordes. They were so common that as the sun touched their overnight resting places, they dropped from the trees like an autumnal shower of falling leaves. Silverwash Fritillary is a beautiful butterfly and it's very conspicuous. And I've been interested in butterflies all my life, and I think I've seen about 5 of them in total. It's now a pretty rare insect in this part of the world. I live in Sussex, which is next to Kent, where this scene was witnessed in 1880. It suggests that this butterfly, at least, used to be massively more common. That description sounds a bit like the monarch butterflies in Mexico, but it's unimaginable today for there to be thousands or millions of Silverwash fritillaries. The population must have declined enormously unless he was imagined the whole thing. And similarly, there's just one other example. I've got an old book, a recipe book for making homemade wine. It was published in 1940. And there's a recipe in there for cowslip wine. And the first step of the recipe is fill 2 buckets with cowslip flowers. Well, I don't know anywhere where you could reasonably do that. Certainly in my part of the world, you'd be hard pushed to cover the bottom of the bucket with cowslip flowers, let alone pick 2 buckets full. And you certainly wouldn't be very popular if you did, but presumably when that recipe was written, that was a perfectly reasonable thing for a human being to do, and presumably didn't take that long, or else they wouldn't have bothered. So these are kind of glimpses that perhaps bioabundance, that wildlife was much, much commoner than any of us can remember, because it happened before we were even born. And then looking in the other direction, the other reason for keeping this kind of shifting baseline idea in mind comes back to my son. And I mentioned how he's grown up in a world. He's used to seeing half as many butterflies as I saw when I was his age. And he thinks that's normal. And the thing that really worries me is what will his children think is normal? Will they see any butterflies, any bumblebees? Let's hope so. So I would argue that insects are important, that these declines should be deeply concerning to us because of all the things that insects do. I've already mentioned they make up the bulk of life on Earth, and they're food for an enormous number of creatures that aren't insects. Things like most bird species, like these gorgeous bee eaters. Many birds eat insects, bats eat insects, freshwater fish like trout and salmon, amphibians, frogs and so on, reptiles, they all depend upon insects. So if the insects disappear, they will disappear. And indeed, there's some of the strongest evidence for insect declines is actually not on populations of insects, but on the decline of insect-eating birds, for which we have longer data sets than we do for insects. And it's striking that if you look at patterns of population change in birds, it tends to be the insect-eating specialists that have undergone the most dramatic declines over time, things like the cuckoo and the spotted flycatcher. Spotted flycatchers were common birds when I was a child. We had them in our garden in the village. You saw them more or less everywhere. Down 93% since 1966. In fact, I read the other day a really depressing statistic that according to the British Trust for Ornithology, overall the breeding bird population of I think it's Britain rather than the UK, fell by about 92 birds per hour every hour from 1966 to the present. That's a mind-boggling statistic and terribly depressing if you dwell on it for too long. Anyway, so insects are important as food. They're also, they do a whole bunch of other things. Aside from being eaten, they're biocontrol agents of lots of pests. Of course, they're often also the pests themselves. They're master recyclers of dung and dead bodies and leaves and trees and all sorts of things. They help to keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds, you name it, they are busy doing it. And most of this is not really appreciated by anybody. Most sort of ordinary members of the public have no idea of all the little jobs that insects do in ecosystems. The one thing that I think most people are aware of is this, pollination, of course, which is often attributed largely or entirely to bees. But of course, there's a lot more to pollination than that. Actually, pollination is done by thousands of species. In the UK, it's estimated there are about 6,000 different insect species that pollinate, including obviously the bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, lots and lots of flies, beetles, and so on. And between them, they provide an absolutely vital function. I probably don't need to be telling you this, but globally, 87% of all plant species need pollinating by some kind of animal to produce seeds. And in the tropics, that might be a hummingbird or a bat. Usually it's an insect. In Europe, it's always an insect. So the vast majority of plants would cease to be able to reproduce if it weren't for insect pollinators. And figures that most people have come across before, approximately 3/4 of the crops that we humans eat benefit from insect pollination. Some would produce nothing at all without insect pollinators. Some would produce some yield, but not as much as they could. So without insect pollinators, we wouldn't have strawberries or raspberries or blueberries or tomatoes, apples, cherries, squashes, pumpkins, all sorts of lovely things. Even coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So life would be pretty awful. And the horrible truth is we couldn't feed everyone a healthy diet without insect pollinators. So we need to make sure we look after them. So I've argued, I hope reasonably convincingly, that insects are important, and because they do stuff that we depend upon. Love them or loathe them, we all need insects because we all need food, amongst other things. But it does worry me slightly, because it seems to me that this is quite a selfish way of looking at the world, that we only value things that do something for us. And not only is it selfish, but it also concerns me because actually I suspect there are quite a few insects that don't do anything for us. But that surely doesn't mean they don't deserve to live. So let me just give you a couple of examples. On the left, that is the St. Helena giant earwig. It was the biggest earwig that has ever lived, so far as we know. It's about 3.5 inches long, a real whopper, only ever found on St. Helena. It's been extinct, we think, since about 1967. It quietly went extinct, probably eaten by introduced rats. And there was no ecological catastrophe as a result. It wasn't providing some vital ecosystem service that St. Helena couldn't cope without. It just went extinct, and nobody really noticed for a long time. But isn't the world a slightly sadder place for the lack of a giant earwig? Even if none of us were ever going to go there and see it, surely that earwig deserved its little burrow on St. Helena and deserved to be left a place to live. And similarly, on the right there's a rather more attractive to most people's eye creature. That's the large blue butterfly, which went extinct in the UK in 1976. And again, it was fine. We didn't suffer as a result. It wasn't doing anything useful. But surely our countryside was a sadder place for not having that butterfly. And in fact, it has been, as many of you will know, successfully reintroduced, and now it's back. So one can see it in the countryside. My point is that I think we have a moral duty to allow the rest of life on our planet to live, to give it some space. You know, people often ask me, what is the point of wasps, or what is the point of mosquitoes? And you can turn it around and say, well, what is the point of humans? Anyway, moving on. So insects are important, and I think deserve looking after for their own sake. If we're going to do that, then we need to understand why they're declining. So what are the causes of insect decline? Well, there are lots, and I could talk about this for a long time, but it would get a bit depressing. You're probably aware of most of them. Loss of habitat is probably the biggest one. The industrialization of farming, pesticides, the spread of foreign diseases, which of course is a particularly acute issue if you're a honeybee keeper. Climate change is starting to kick in, and so on. I've only got time to talk. I'd say a few things about this broad subject. So first of all, habitat loss, which is probably still the biggest issue for biodiversity globally. So this intensive farming, this monoculture farming, is spreading across the globe. Every year more and more land is farmed in this way. Forests are cleared to make way for soybean fields and so on. I don't know actually where this picture was taken. I just found it on the internet, but I thought it made my point quite well. Something used to live here. If you could go in a time machine, there would have been natural vegetation. There would have been flowers, maybe trees, maybe there was a forest. There would have been butterflies and bees and birds and so on. Now there's basically nothing apart from one crop. The biodiversity is close to zero. And we're doing this over huge areas. And so of course that has a massive impact on not just insects, but on all biodiversity. But then associated with this kind of farming system is the heavy use of chemicals, both fertilizers and particularly pesticides. It's actually, since I produced this slide, the latest estimate I've seen is that we're now up to using 4 million tons of pesticides per year. That's the active ingredient in the pesticide, and it's climbing. According to DEFRA figures in England, the average arable field is sprayed 17.4 times a year. And that could be with fungicides, herbicides, molluscicides, or insecticides. Obviously that's going to have a big impact on biodiversity. We're basically trying to kill everything that isn't the crop. Actually, we have it pretty lucky in Europe because pesticide use here is much better regulated than it is anywhere else in the world. It's not great, but it could be much, much worse. In North America, they're much more gung-ho about their pesticide use, and they still, for example, spray pesticides from the air sometimes, which is an incredibly indiscriminate way of using them. They also have available a far wider range of pesticides than we do in Europe, because many pesticides have been banned in Europe, but not in North America. But it's even worse in developing countries, sadly. I took this picture in just outside Calcutta a couple of years ago, just before the lockdown. This is a sort of peasant farmer. He's got a couple of acres there on the edge of the city where he grows fruit and veg. He's spraying Paraquat there. Paraquat's a herbicide that's long since been banned in Europe because it's incredibly poisonous to people. You only need to drink a drop or so and it'll kill you. And this guy is applying it without any protective equipment. He's had no training, he's had no advice on safety. He's using some ancient pump mechanism and an old plastic bottle, as you can see. He hasn't even got shoes on. And the thing that makes me really angry is that Paraquat is manufactured in Huddersfield in England. It's the main factory in the world. So we've banned its use in Europe, but we're more than happy to manufacture thousands of tons of it and sell it to people like this guy, who then risks poisoning himself when he uses it. Really frustrating and incredibly hypocritical. So we use a lot of pesticides around the world, applied in all sorts of different ways by all sorts of different people. And we've done a pretty good job of contaminating the whole global environment. If you're a beekeeper, you should be really interested in this map. So what this is showing you is results of a Swiss study. It was kind of a citizen science study. So they were interested in a particular group of pesticides called Neonicotinoids, which many of you will have heard of. They've become notorious because they're incredibly poisonous to bees and, in fact, any insect. And in fact, they've been banned in Europe since this study was published in 2017 because of concerns and growing evidence that they were doing a lot of damage to the environment generally. But anyway, in 2017, these scientists, they asked Swiss people going on holiday to bring them back a jar of honey from wherever they were going. And you can see they managed to find, Swiss people obviously go on holiday to some interesting places. They managed to get honey samples from all over the world. And they got the honey samples and they screened them for these neonicotinoid pesticides. So just look at the little round dots, ignore the pie chart bits of this map. Each little dot is a honey sample. And if it's white, there was no neonicotinoid in the honey. If it was orange, the strength of the color indicates the concentration of the pesticide. So overall, 3/4 of the world's honey samples are contaminated with these neonicotinoids, which are neurotoxins that are toxic to honeybees in minute doses. A honeybee has to consume about 4 billionths of a gram of this stuff to kill it. And most honeybees in the world have these chemicals in their honey. This isn't just of concern to honeybees, because of course the honeybees are being contaminated by feeding on contaminated flowers. If honeybees are feeding on contaminated flowers, that means that all the other pollinating insects are feeding on contaminated flowers. The thousands and thousands of other species of bee, butterfly, moth, and so on. They're all being poisoned all over the world. Isn't that terribly depressing? Okay, so I've nearly finished depressing the hell out of you, and we'll soon move on to some positive stuff. So that's pesticides. I just wanted to say a tiny bit about one other driver of insect declines, which is much less discussed and thought about, and that's light pollution. But it's recently come to light, sorry about the pun, that that light pollution is having quite a negative impact on many insects, particularly nocturnal insects. The most obvious impact is that bright lights suck in thousands of flying insects at night, which fly round and round in circles, bashing themselves to a dusty death on the light, and make easy prey for bats and other creatures that like to eat insects. But there are more subtle influences too. It was recently discovered, for example, that the life cycles of insects, the timing of the life cycles are disrupted by lights at night. So lights at night can lead insects to believe the day length is longer than it actually is. So they mistime their emergence from hibernation, come out too early when it's still winter, which is obviously a catastrophe. And there's even a really interesting study on dung beetles. Some dung beetles roll balls of dung and use the light of the Milky Way to orientate themselves when they push their ball of dung along. But if there's light pollution, they can't detect the Milky Way, and they get lost and go round and round in circles, poor things. Anyway, one way or another, we've made life quite hard for our insects. Let's move on to something more positive, which is, what can we do about it? And this genuinely is good news here, because so lots of environmental issues, you feel helpless, you know, ice caps melting, rainforest burning and so on. But insects are different. Most of them haven't gone extinct yet. And an awful lot of them live all around us. And they can recover really quickly if we do some simple things to help them. So this is something that everyone can get involved in and actually kind of get the positive feedback of seeing what they're doing working. So broadly, what do we need to do? Well, we need to make our gardens more insect friendly. That's a really easy thing, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Then going kind of around clockwise from top left, we need to think about farming, and that's a tougher nut to crack. How do we feed the world without destroying the world? Maybe one of the biggest questions we need to ask ourselves. How do we put back more flowers? We've lost incredible areas of beautiful flower-rich grasslands and meadows in Europe in recent decades. We can recreate them, and I think in some areas we should be recreating them. And then just to the final picture, we need to stop spraying as many pesticides, because clearly that's not really compatible with thriving insect populations. So on to gardening. So just in the United Kingdom, there are about 22 million private gardens, covering an area of about 400,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. And just imagine if they were all wildlife friendly, they were all full of the right kinds of flowers, wildflowers, pesticide free, with a little pond and a bee hotel and loads of insects buzzing about. And imagine too, the councils were on board, so that the road verges were full of flowers, the roundabouts were full of flowers, the city parks weren't mowed every 5 minutes, the cemeteries were full of flowers. That would then create a kind of national network of insect-friendly habitat. And this isn't just a sort of crazy pipe dream of mine and a few other fanatical insect lovers. It's actually happening. This is what's kind of exciting, that there are lots and lots of people who are doing this right now, that are making their gardens a bit wild, at planting flowers to encourage insects. There are councils coming on board, reducing their mowing of verges and sowing wildflowers and so on. So it is happening, but it needs to happen faster, and it's something that anyone who's got a garden or even just a window box can do something to help. You can probably tell I'm quite excited about this. I'm sorry for plugging my own books, but I've written some books about it, should you be interested in knowing more. Or I've made lots of YouTube videos about things you can do in your garden to make it more wildlife friendly. So gardens can be incredibly biodiverse, far more so than I think any of you would guess. And this is illustrated beautifully by the obsessive life of a lady called Jenny Owen, who lived in Leicester. She had a little garden in urban Leicester. It was about 1/8 of an acre, so not terribly big at all. And she spent her life, well, a big chunk of her life, 35 years, she spent cataloguing everything she could find in her little garden. And every plant, every animal. She got experts in to help her with some of the really difficult to identify things. She wrote a book about it, The Wildlife of the Garden, should you be interested. Anyway, her grand species list for her little garden after 35 years was 2,673 different species of animal and plant, of which 1,997 were different types of insect. I just think those numbers are amazing. You know, I mean, who would have thought it? I would have guessed you might find those kind of numbers of species in a bit of rainforest, but in an urban garden in Leicester, which is not known as a biodiversity hotspot, I think that's really, really impressive. And we could all do that. We could all have thousands of species living in our backyards. So how do we make our gardens insect friendly? Well, there are lots of things we can do, and I'm sure you're very familiar with most of them, and particularly as I know tonight's audience is largely beekeepers, you'll be very familiar with the plants that are good for your bees, and many of them are also good for other wildlife. Broadly, old-fashioned cottage garden perennials, herbs, tend to be much better than annual bedding plants. Avoid double varieties with extra petals in particular. There's loads of advice out there, and a lot of it is pretty good. And again, I can direct you to my books and YouTube videos should you want, or the RHS has a good list of pollinator friendly plants you can grow and so on. While we're on the subject of plants, I have to mention the subject of weeds. So these are all other things that we can do to add more flowers, to support more pollinating insects in our urban areas. Starting top left with dandelions. Well, not just dandelions. Dandelions as representatives of the group of plants which are generally persecuted as being unwelcome in our gardens. If you're a gardener, you're taught that there are some plants that you're basically a bad gardener if you have dandelions or thistles or ragwort growing in your garden, just to give you some examples. But these are native wildflowers. They're really important for pollinators, particularly some of these early flowering things like dandelions are a really good source of nectar for hungry bees just coming out of hibernation and so on. So if, this is maybe a bit silly, but you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, just by calling them all wildflowers, because these are native wildflowers, and we really ought to be a bit more tolerant of them. So then again, going around clockwise from the dandelions, flowering trees are absolutely fantastic. You've got room, and this doesn't just apply to gardens. I would love it. I don't know why we don't plant avenues of fruit trees in our city streets and in our parks so that people can pick their own fruit on the way into work or school or whatever. If you've got room in a garden, even if you've got a small garden, you can get fruit trees on dwarfing rootstocks that really don't take up much room at all. And the spring blossom is a fantastic resource for pollinating insects of all sorts. And of course, they return the favor by pollinating the fruit tree and giving you your own healthy 0 food miles fruit later in the year. Then there's, of course, moving around to the next picture, lawns. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. We should try and mow less. We have this kind of obsession with mowing. My dad, I often think he's 89 and he still tries to kind of recreate a Wimbledon tennis court with stripes on it in his back garden. A lot of people mow every fortnight and it's completely unnecessary. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of petrol. And you basically mow up any insects like grasshoppers or whatever that have dared to stray onto your lawn. And you get rid of any flower buds that might be daring to try and flower. And if you can just relax a bit. And, so next time you think the lawn is looking a bit shaggy and needs mowing, if instead of getting out the mower, you can get out a deck chair, make yourself a coffee or a gin and tonic or whatever, and just relax and enjoy the peace and watch the insects arrive and the flowers unfold. That's my lawn, by the way, and I haven't put any flowers in it. That's just what pops up when you don't mow. And then, of course, it's not just gardens that have mown lawns. Road verges, all sorts of municipal spaces are frequently mowed for no good reason at all, as far as I can tell. They don't have to be. So there's an example, bottom left, of a road, what used to be a boring mown road verge, which has been sown with wildflower seeds. It's actually in Stirling in Scotland where I used to work. And that was done by a little group called On the Verge, who've so far planted wildflowers in, I think it's 93 different sites like that all around the city of Stirling in Scotland. So there's roundabouts and edge of a rugby pitch and parks and primary school fields, and even the women's prison now has a patch of wildflowers in it. Sadly, instead of doing this kind of thing, quite a lot of councils do this kind of thing. I'm sure you know what this is. This is signs of herbicide use, almost certainly Roundup, which is the active ingredient glyphosate, which is the herbicide of choice worldwide. And it's sprayed in many of our cities, it's sprayed everywhere. Teams of people tour the streets employed by the council to look for anything green and kill it. Isn't that strange? Why do we do that? So top right there, there's a little bit of, well, it was a bit of grass. There may have been a dandelion or two, perhaps a flower or two, probably not much, but it might have supported a little bit of life. Someone's come along and sprayed it, and now it's dead. It looks awful. Surely that looks worse than if it had been green and alive. Why do we do that? It seems like just senseless environmental vandalism to me. But there you go. But aside from the impact on the environment, there is a sinister human health aspect to this, which is that there's pretty clear evidence that glyphosate causes cancer in people. And yet we spray it on our streets. And as you can see with the other pictures, we even spray it around children's play equipment in children's play parks, just because it's a convenient way to tidy them up. That just seems absolutely bonkers to me. If I had my way, I'd ban pesticides for garden use, for urban use completely. In fact, I launched a petition on the UK government website calling for people to sign up to ban urban pesticide use. Sadly, it's just expired, so there's no point in my asking you to sign it. We got 53,000 signatures, which wasn't bad, but I don't suppose is going to persuade the government to do this. You might think this is quite a radical suggestion, but I would argue it isn't. The French have actually already done it. They did it in 2018. They introduced a law that unless you're a registered farmer, you can't buy pesticides in France. So local authorities can't buy them. Homeowners can't buy them. And France is still standing. It's still fine. It's not been overrun with cockroaches or dandelions, as far as I know. Although I've not been for a couple of years. Maybe it has. I doubt it. Anyway, we can do without them, I think, in our gardens. I could talk much longer about that, but I'll spare you. So that's it for gardens. Just for the last couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about the bigger issue of farming. Is industrialized farming the only way we can feed everybody? I think a lot of people kind of without just have accepted that that is true without really thinking about it. Or we just accept industrial farming as the norm, the whole shifting baseline idea. We see giant fields being sprayed with poison, and we think that that's perfectly reasonable because we've seen it all our lives. Actually, I think you can make a pretty good argument that if we carry on with this industrial farming approach, people will starve because it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable in a number of ways, which are kind of exemplified by these three pictures. It's wiping out biodiversity, and yet it depends upon biodiversity. It needs healthy soils. It needs pollinators. It needs natural enemies of crop pests to be sustainable. So it's wiping out biodiversity. It's doing terrible damage to the soil itself. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of the world's soils are already badly degraded. How are we going to grow food in the future if we don't look after our soils better? And then polar bears representing climate change. Food production and the way we farm is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions at present, and we obviously have to rein that in. So basically we can't carry on, I don't think, the way we're currently farming. So what should we be doing? Well, I haven't got time I'm more or less out of time. But there are some principles I think we should look for in a truly sustainable farming system for the future. It needs to look after soil. It needs to work with nature rather than trying to kill and control everything, which means I think it needs either much fewer or no pesticides. And of course, it needs to produce enough food, and it needs to produce enough healthy food, a diverse, healthy diet for us humans. And that sounds like a big ask. Can we come up with a scheme that does all of these things? Well, actually, we already have. There are types of farm that do all of this already and deserve a lot more attention. I haven't got time to tell you about them at all, but all of these are examples of farming types that have much greater diversity of crops. They're focused on...
Sorry, Dave, I think your microphone is frozen.
I
You're back again.
sorry, where did I, can you hear me now?
Yes, you can hear you now perfectly well. No, we lost you for about 30 seconds.
Okay, sorry, could you just tell me what was the last thing I said?
Oh dear.
Don't worry.
I think we were talking
I'll
about,
just carry on.
yes.
So I would argue that there is a the future of farming lies here somewhere, with these systems of farming that basically have much higher crop diversity, focus heavily on looking after the soil, usually are selling their food to local people rather than onto commodity markets around the world. All of them, I visited things like biodynamic farms, which are teeming with life and yet really productive, and the soil is rich and full of worms. And that strikes me as a much better future than what we have at present. Anyway, whatever we do, just to finish off, we have to do a better job of looking after this. You know, we live on this rock hurtling through space. It's the most extraordinary thing, and there's a little crust of life clinging to its surface, mostly insects. It's everything, you know, it's our home. There is no planet B, cliche or not. And it really worries the hell out of me that we've been so reckless with this amazing planet. We have to do better, or else, you know, there's a real risk that our children will inherit an impoverished planet. And, you know, I mean, we would all do anything for our kids apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. It's nuts. So let's do better. And what better place to start than by looking after the insects that live all around us. Thank you, everybody. I hope you could hear me. I didn't keep cutting out, but I shall stop sharing my slides at that point.
Right. Well, David, thank you very, very much indeed. As I say, it's all cause for much thought as to what we're actually doing to the environment, and the destruction that has been, as you say, wielded for a very, very long time, long before the statistics that we were quoting were coming out. And I think I do tend to sort of go back and to sort of say is that I've read in one of your books is that the neonicotinoids are something like 27,000 times more toxic than DDT, and DDT was thrown around like water from the 1940s onwards. Absolutely appalling. So a huge number of insects probably died really from the time that it was brought out. Anyway, absolutely very, very interesting indeed. I have to say, I did wonder about the shield bug that looked a bit like Elvis, as to whether or not, because we've got 3 or 4 million species of insect that are not classified, or you know, could there be one that looks like Adele these days? You never know. So
you never know, do you? Yeah, that's one to look forward to discovering.
Right. If we could go, please go on just to the questions. As I say, again, I'd like to thank Thorns for their very, very kind sponsorship of this particular lecture. And as I say, I hope everybody has enjoyed it very, very much. I have to say, it's food for thought. Okay. So the first question is from Robin, and he says, in the German research, did they identify which areas the greatest declines were in, and perhaps why?
They were unable to identify why. The only thing they tried to investigate was whether climate could have changed enough to be driving it, and they came to the conclusion that it couldn't. You know, in that 26-year period, the climate didn't really change terribly much. But otherwise, they speculate that it's it's interesting that there are nature reserves, which remain nature reserves to this day. The nature reserves themselves haven't been destroyed. But the authors of the paper suspect that it's because those nature reserves are basically islands surrounded by can't speak tonight, I've worn my mouth out, inhospitable habitat, a lot of intensive farmland. So any insect that wanders out of the nature reserve is unlikely to come back, basically. And there's this idea of metapopulation collapse, that small isolated populations will eventually go extinct just by bad luck or whatever. And if those islands are never going to be recolonized because there's no neighbors, no other islands nearby, then slowly insects and other animals will disappear island by island. But we don't, the honest truth is they don't know for sure. This is just kind of speculation, but clearly those declines that they describe in Germany are, you know, seriously alarming.
Right, okay. The next question, in fact, there's a few people who have asked this question. It does come to this subject over the honeybees versus solitary bees debate. And well, one question from John says, does Professor Goulson have any opinion or even evidence or data of whether us as honeybee farmers, as a mono insect intensive farmer, are causing declining wild bee or other pollinators, or are honeybees more specialized that they don't compete?
They do compete, there's no doubt at all. I mean, honeybees are not at all specialized in terms of the flowers that they visit. They're huge generalists. They visit hundreds and hundreds of different species, and they overlap enormously with wild pollinators. And there's pretty clear evidence that there is competition. For example, there were studies done on bumblebee nests that if you put a bumblebee nest close to a large apiary, it grows much more slowly than if it's away from the apiary. And it's common sense that if we all, I think, would accept that one of the reasons pollinators have declined is because there aren't many flowers in the modern world. Well, you know, the more mouths there are to feed with a restricted supply of food, the tougher it's going to be for everybody. And there's also pretty clear evidence that there's disease flow, both into and out of hives and into and out of honeybees and between them and wild bees like bumblebees. But the evidence is that because of the large numbers of honeybees in apiaries, there's more flow out of the hives into wild bees than there is back. But all of that said, you know, there's room for both, and honeybee keepers are usually the allies of conservationists. We all want to see fewer pesticides, more flowers, better management of the countryside. And if we provide those things and look after the land better, then there should be room for honeybees and all the wild pollinators as well, I would argue.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. As much as we could improve the habitat and create more, yes, the will be there for everyone. I think that there's certain probably small pockets where it's being a problem. Say, for example, there's been a proliferation of beehives and rooftops in London at a very high concentration, and that is proving to be a problem even for the honeybees. There's just not enough forage around. So, but that's a localized area. Right. Well, I think it's just more a statement here, is to stop the use of all chemicals and fertilizers, all of which disrupt nature, but we would agree with that. Next one here is from Michael. He says, do you think that the last war was the biggest change that affected habitat loss in the UK, with the conversion of all available land to cultivation under the Dig for Victory era?
It certainly was a big turning point, and it drove, you know, the introduction of policies to maximize yields at all costs, and the introduction of subsidies to grub out hedgerows, make fields bigger, drain marshes, bring as much land as possible into production. Most of those laws came into effect during the Second World War and made perfect sense, you know, when there were U-boats in the Atlantic and so on. But we just carried on with the same policies for another 40, 50 years, long after there were food mountains in Europe. And that, you know, we should have reined it in a lot earlier, in my opinion, but it's taken a long time to change. And I think we're still suffering to some extent from, you know, the legacy of those war years. So yeah, absolutely, it was a real turning point, sadly.
Yeah, well, certainly, yes, we might be still living under the aftermath of that, indeed. Peter is asking here, as winters get milder and wetter, willows, for example, are an essential resource and are flowering earlier. How will insects adapt to earlier flowering?
Yeah, we don't really know, but there have been there's obviously concern that that things might get out of sync, that, you know, pollinators might find that they're emerging before or after key floral resources that they rely on. And that could happen if they're using different cues to trigger their emergence from hibernation to the plants. If one's using day length and the other is using temperature, then the day length obviously hasn't changed with climate change, but the temperature has. And so you could end up with mismatches. So far, I'm not aware of any really clear, strong evidence that that's had a big negative impact. But of course, it's going to, any mismatches are going to get worse over time. So yeah, it's likely to become a problem. But I mean, that said, for bees, because they're things like bumblebees and honeybees are quite generalized. If some plants are moving around in terms of when they're flowering, I suspect that those social bees will be able to adapt, but it may have more impact on the solitary bees, which have much smaller flight windows.
Yeah, well, certainly it's been a very mild winter so far, certainly in my part of the world. And certainly I'm surprised at how many days during early December and in fact through January into February that my bees have been flying. Quite incredible. There's quite a long question here, so I'll probably try and pre-say it. And it really is a gentleman he's turned over a large part of his garden to wildflowers and had a great time through the summer. Thought it was all great. Saw lots of pollinators and insects visiting. The downside was that at the end of the season, everything dies back, and he was afraid to cut them back, as he was concerned that a lot maybe of insects would still be living there and going into hibernation. He was wanting to know how he should manage that, and should he be cutting this right back so that he could start next year afresh? Yeah,
so traditional meadow management that produced the beautiful flowery meadows that we used to, the hay meadows and chalk downlands and so on, was based on there being at least one cut a year with removal of the hay rather than leaving it on the ground. But if you've only got a small area, it does seem, I know exactly that feeling that you think, well, there's now all this life in August, September, which is traditionally when you might cut, and I'm going to destroy it all if I cut it all flat. What I do is leave some long patches over the winter and then mow them the next year. So there's always some areas that haven't been recently cut. It's a bit more of a fiddle, but if it's in a garden, it's not really that much trouble to do. So that's what I would suggest.
Mm-hmm. We'll certainly say that this whole idea of what we do, say around sort of municipal flower beds and so forth. I mean, I'm just taking my own example in my own area here. Is I heard an excuse given because they do change beds with different sort of flowering plants through the season. They come in and they grub up the previous plants are there and put in new ones. But I discovered then that they were spraying these beds with glyphosate about 2 weeks before they came to grub them up, because they claimed it was easier to dig them up when they had a couple of weeks of glyphosate on them. I was astonished, absolutely astonished.
Yeah, that seems incredibly lazy.
Yes, that's right. Okay. We move on then to Stephen. It says, is the increase in honeybee numbers a factor in the decline of wild bee populations, and should we consider reducing the number of hives we keep?
I don't think there is any evidence that I'm aware of suggesting that honeybees have driven bee declines. They may be a contributing factor, but they're probably not the major one. The only time I think there is reason for serious concern is if there are situations where there is a known population of a rare bee of some sort, for example, in a nature reserve, you probably wouldn't want to take a whole bunch of hives and put them there. That would be silly, I would argue. So there are a few sensitive areas where you might avoid putting your hives to minimize any impact on particularly rare wild bees. But generally speaking, in the wider farmed countryside, as long as you haven't got ridiculous numbers of hives and you try to provide as many flowers as you can, then I think you can minimize the conflict there.
All right, okay. There's just a question here about which outlets should we buy your books from. Now, I know many of them should be generally available in most of the major bookstores. certainly I would tend to plug a very good sponsor of ours, which is Northern Bee Books in Hilton Bridge, and certainly I would think that Jerry Burbidge there would be keeping your books indeed. So, but I'm sure they're widely available.
They are. Just if you can possibly afford not to buy them from Amazon, please don't.
That's right. Right. Well, to Steve, what are your thoughts about insect hotels and how useful they are for solitary wild bees and other beneficial insects? Now I'm hearing that they harbor mites and other parasitic bugs.
Yeah, it's become quite controversial. There's a sort of ongoing social media row about this at the moment. I mean, there's an awful lot of rubbish sold in the way of insect hotels. Some of them claim all sorts of things. You know, there are butterfly hibernation boxes, which no butterfly would ever go anywhere near. There are claims that, you know, lacewing houses, ladybird houses, and all sorts of things tend not to work. But the bee ones often do work. You know, it's mason bees, it's almost always one species of perhaps two or three, but red mason bees are by far the most common creatures to turn up, and they will occupy, if it's a reasonably well designed bee hotel, and you can make them yourself very easily with a drill. I've got a YouTube video about how to do it, should you be interested. But then, so they are successful in attracting the bees, but then some people argue that they do more harm than good unless you clean them out every year, because they do often, the bees become infested with pollen mites, which don't look pretty, and sometimes you can get parasitic wasps attracted as well. And so some people religiously clean out their bee hotel every winter, if it's a design where you can dismantle them, which some are. And they sterilize everything and put it back together. And if you want to maximize the mason bee population, that's probably the right thing to do. But I kind of think that the pollen mites and the parasitoid wasps are all just, you know, just as important as the mason bees, really. You know, they're all natural, they're all native species. They deserve to be there as much as the bees. And in the wild, nobody cleans out the holes that bees nest in. So I kind of, I've got about 20 bee hotels, and I've got a big population of solitary bees in them, and a fair few mites and other things, and I'm quite happy with that. So I would suggest we, you know, they probably do. They're great for education for kids, actually. You can get some bee hotels with little windows on the side so that you can see what's happening, and I think they're brilliant for that. My kids have, when they were younger, loved peeking inside. So I'm in favour of bug hotels, but only the better designed ones for bees that seem to work.
Yeah, I think there's a comment here just from Georgina saying also we should be cleaning our bird feeders as well, because they can sometimes be a reservoir for disease. It can build up very rapidly, in fact. So that is absolutely true. There's another question here that I think is from one of our German listeners, and he's asking, what is your opinion on wildflowers? Now, I think he probably means wildflower seed mixtures that are on sale in some of the garden centres. I think there's been some comment about this recently, is that wildflower mixtures in fact can end up sort of producing plants that aren't native to your local area.
Yes, I mean, that is an issue. I mean, and there are different sort of levels to this. There are some suppliers that will sell what they call wildflower seeds, which aren't even European. I've seen wildflower mixes that include things like cosmos from North America, which I find slightly strange. But even when they are native species, they're very unlikely to be of local provenance, and they might not be species that are suited to the soil in your local area. And there is a bit of a danger that by distributing wildflower seeds all over the place, we're kind of homogenizing the flora somewhat. So it's a difficult one, though, because we don't want to discourage people from growing wildflowers. Ideally, try and find some seed that is as local as possible. And you can collect your own seed if you're keen and can find the plant in the wild. And I don't see anything wrong with collecting a few seeds to grow yourself. But it's a lot of trouble, and most people aren't realistically going to go out and collect their own wildflower seeds. So I think make sure it's native and try to find a local supplier, but I think we have to accept that there's going to be a degree of jumbling up of plant species, which is probably unavoidable.
Right, okay. Well, now I think would have to make this the last question, because we've been going on now for a little bit over time. And it comes from Patrick, and he said that there are some insects increasing, such as the tree bumblebees. And have you really any comments on this?
Well, thank God there are, which is, no, the tree bumblebee is a really fascinating creature, and we don't fully understand why it's bucking the trend so well, other than, I actually, to blow my own trumpet for a second, I have the honor of being the first person to catch a tree bumblebee in the United Kingdom in 2001 in the edge of the New Forest. And I thought, what the hell is this? Anyway, but I think the key with the tree bumblebee is they love to nest in tip boxes. And they're very much a garden bee. They thrive, and they've occupied blue tip boxes the length and breadth of the country. So it seems to be that just by chance we've provided them with a home unwittingly, and that whether that's the only reason they've done so well, I don't know. But there are some winners. There's no doubt there are some insects that have become more common in recent years. The average might be negative, but there are a few success stories, and I guess we should celebrate those and be glad that, you know, they're not all in trouble.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, Dave, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a fascinating lecture, and certainly from some of the comments I'm seeing here from the chat line, it was very much appreciated, and people thanking you very much, and certainly some advice going up on what we should be doing with various seed mixtures and so on and so forth, and also banning insecticides from garden centres. And I think that possibly many of us would in fact maybe help to try and take that up. And certainly, you know, this lecture, although it was not directly to do with bees, it was all part of what's called a scheme in Ireland for promoting pollinators, and that is the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which has been very active across the whole of the island of Ireland, and as I understand was in fact spearheaded by, I think, one of your former PhD students, in fact. So it's Jane Stout from Trinity College Dublin. And indeed that we have been sort of in close liaison with the All Ireland Pollinator Plan over this last few years to try and see if we help promote this across the whole of the island of Ireland. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you have enjoyed that very much, and indeed I would like to say is that all of these webinars that we've been showing over this last number of weeks are in fact being recorded, and they will be on the Ulster Beekeepers website from about the end of February, or towards the end of February. Okay, so if you wish to see them again, they will be available to those who have registered, and they will be on the website for about 6 months. Okay, next week is our last webinar in this series, and again we will be great to have Professor Jamie Ellis from Florida speaking to us again on a year in the life of the honeybee colony. And I'm sure that we'll all be looking forward to hearing Jamie Ellis again. So again, really, as I say, I'd like you all to thank you for coming to this webinar. And again, thank you to Professor Goulson for a fascinating talk. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll bid you good night.